By now, you may be noticing something. Not all Christian views of the end times are pessimistic. Not all expectations of history get darker and darker until Christ returns. Today, we're going to look at a view that many Christians today find quite surprising, and sometimes even a little uncomfortable. It's called Postmillennialism, and whether you agree with it or not, this view once shaped how Christians, they built schools, abolished slaveries, sent missionaries, and imagined the future. Here's the big idea. Postmillennialism teaches that Christ's reign is now, and that the gospel will advance powerfully in history, and that Christ will return after a long period of the gospel-shaped flourishing. This view is the view that marked a hopeful confidence and not fear. The word postmillennial simply means Christ returns after the millennium. Like amillennialism, postmillennialism believes that Christ is reigning now. The millennium, it's not a literal 1,000-year reign, but unlike amillennialism, it expects the gospel to transform societies and not just individuals. The millennium, it represents a long period of increasing gospel influence before Christ returns. Postmillennialism, it leans heavily into Jesus' kingdom parables. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that grows. Leaven working through dough. The imagery is not of sudden collapse, but of gradual expansion. The gospel, it starts small, but it doesn't stay small. Postmillennial Christians often emphasize passages like Psalm 110, where the Messiah reigns until his enemies are subdued, or Isaiah 2, where the nations are streaming into the mountain of the Lord, or Matthew 28, Christ has authority over all nations. 1 Corinthians 15, Christ reigns until the final enemy is destroyed. In this view, history is not random. It is the stage on which Christ reigns. It progressively is revealed. Postmillennialism reads Revelation symbolically, much like amillennialism, but it emphasizes Christ's victory and Satan's defeat, the binding of Satan as the restraint of deception, the success of the gospel that's amongst the nations. Revelation is read less as a forecast of disaster and more of a proclamation of victory. Postmillennialism flourishes during periods of cultural and missionary expansion. It was common amongst the Reformation thinkers and the Puritan theologians and the 18th and 19th century missionaries. It was the worldview behind the global missions movement, of our education reform, of social reform efforts. Christians believed the gospel, it would shape the world. It's important to be honest. Postmillennialism declined sharply after the devastation of the 20th century, the world wars, the genocides, global suffering. Optimism about the inevitable progress, it became harder to sustain, and many Christians shifted towards views that emphasized endurance over transformation. But let's name its strengths fairly. Postmillennialism, it takes the Great Commission seriously. It encourages this long-term faithfulness and inspires cultural engagement. It refuses to be despaired. It reminds the church that Christ's resurrection, it matters in history, not just in heaven. Some hear postmillennialism and Christians think that they've built heaven and earth. They ignore suffering. That's a naive optimism. Faithful postmillennialism rejects those caricatures. It affirms that Christ alone brings the final kingdom. Suffering, it's real, But victory is grounded in Christ, not human effort. This view, it asks a very honest question. What if the gospel really is as powerful as we say it is? What if obedience matters not just for souls, but for history? If this view is true, then faithfulness is generational. Discipleship shapes culture. Missions is long-term. And hope, it fuels obedience. The church, it's not waiting for collapse. The church is bearing witness to victory. Next week, we'll turn to the view that dominates most of modern evangelicalism, dispensational premillennialism, where it came from, why it resonates, and how it differs from historic premillennialism. Again, not to critique harshly, but to understand clearly. And if this episode challenged your assumptions, consider subscribing. And in the comments, I'd love to ask, do you find hope in the idea that the gospel is transforming history, or does it just feel unrealistic? Grace and peace to you. I'll see you next time.